Genesis 6, sons of God, daughters of men. Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward. I have to be careful here. They weren't thinking about Genesis 6. Well, what about the angels that sinned? Oh, well, that was some other rebellion. The only reference you get to angels sinning is Genesis 6. And not only that, but Peter will use vocabulary like, having them being chained in gloomy darkness.
Dr. Michael Heiser explains what exactly Genesis 6 is all about. So let's get right into it. Shout out to Dr. Michael Heiser and all the amazing things that he has done. Guys, this is absolutely amazing. I promise you it will blow you away. Here we go.
Genesis 6. Okay, again, we're all familiar with this passage. Sons of God, daughters of men. Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward. Well, for sure, we need to strip the supernatural out of this puppy. Because this one just gets you a little weird. So the sons of God have to be just normal guys, and the Nephilim have to just be normal guys and girls doing what guys and girls do. And
what?
Oh, it's just awful, isn't it? And if you've read the book, or if you've heard me at any point, you know that I think views that try to strip the supernatural out of Genesis 6, I have to be careful here, are ridiculous.
Yeah.
Did I use that word already? And what I mean by that is, look, nobody, people who are reading these texts who were not sort of conditioned to not let them say what they plainly say, took a supernatural view of this. They weren't troubled, by some of the questions that pop into our heads. Well, how does this work? And they're not there. They reflexively do this. And two of the people that do that are Peter and Jude. So now you got a problem, which is why you'll read all sorts of exegetical gymnastics that will say things like Peter and Jude, they weren't thinking about Genesis 6. Well, what about the angels that sinned? Oh, well, that was some other rebellion that we probably don't have preserved. Well, that's nice. So in other words, you're basing your position on something that doesn't exist in the text, right? Yes, that would be correct. Yeah, but they'll be content to do that.
Yeah.
Well, what about the great rebellion of the third of the angels and all this stuff, before creation and all this kind of stuff? I've tried really hard to find that in Genesis, but I can't. In fact, the only place you will find it in Revelation 12 associates it with the first coming of the Messiah, which was a little after creation. Okay, so the chronology doesn't work there. The only reference you get to angels sinning is Genesis 6. And not only that, but Peter will use vocabulary like, having them being chained in gloomy darkness. Okay, tartarao, sent to Tartarus, which, again, our translations typically obscure. It'll have hell or Hades or something like that. Well, that's vocabulary that comes right out of the, Greco-Roman Titan story. And there are actually two Titan stories, but one of them has, again, cohabitation between the divine beings and human women, and they produce kind of funky offspring. Okay, this is just what you get. And Peter and Jude are obviously familiar with that stuff, and they're not flustered by it at all. They embrace it. They bring it into their text. It just is what it is. So you can say that Peter and Jude were wrong. You can do that, but that's basically what you have to do.
That's crazy.
To eviscerate or, cut the supernatural out of Genesis 6, 1-4. But
wild. So many people will be so hardcore on reading everything so literal within the Bible, and then they won't even take the most literal things about anything supernatural and say, no, that's just a metaphor. No, that's just symbolic. No, that's just something completely different. But what is going on there? Why do they take that view on everything so literal? But then when you get to something supernatural like angels, nah. I think there needs to be a both end here.
Said all that. What I think the real significant thing is the Mesopotamian context. Now, I don't have a lot of this in Unseen Realm. So unless you have read Anas's article, and I've recommended it several times on my website, if you go up to my website, and it is actually working today. It wasn't working earlier this week, but we knew about that. If you put in his last name, Annus, and put in something like Watchers, okay, you're going to find this article on my site. It is available online. I don't know who posted it online, but it's there, so go get it. But the reason why this is important, I mean, Annus is not the first. He's not the first person to draw attention to, before his time, people would say is a possible context for Genesis 6:1-4. He is the person who's done the most work here, and it's very recent. So his article that you can get on my site was written in 2010. What that means is that every commentary that your pastor has, okay, that he's going to pull off the shelf to resist you and your ideas and Mike and his ideas, is by definition obsolete out of the gate. If it's not written past 2010, and if it doesn't interact with this material, it doesn't have a prayer of interpreting the passage in its own context. That's just the way it is. He may not like it, but that's the way it is. Scholars actually do stuff and they learn things. I mean, I know that's kind of shocking. I mean, they don't just sit there and twiddle their. If they were like medical doctors, you could say, "Oh, they're playing golf." What do the other ones do? They play asteroids or something, or Angry Birds. That's what they do all day. Some of them are at the asteroid. I mean, I would be. The scholarship advances, and Annus's article is a wonderful case of it. I'm going to take you through some of what he says in the article. And the Mesopotamian story, there's a backstory here that is very clear that this is what Genesis 6:1-4 was shooting at. This is why these 4 verses even exist in the text. The writer was shooting at something very, very deliberate. This is a quote from Annus, the Mesopotamian Apkallus. Now, Apkallu was a Mesopotamian. Before the flood, they were completely divine. After the flood, they're not.
Oh.
Okay? After the flood, they're for lack of a better term, they're a mixture. They're a hybrid between divine and human, and they also happen to be giants. Okay, if it gives you a little idea where we're headed here. Okay, Apkallu were the wise men. They're cast as the culture heroes of Mesopotamia, the great divine minds that brought civilization to humans, dispensed it from their divine realm to humans. And this is the Mesopotamian explanation for why they're just so great. Why Mesopotamia is just so great, especially Babylon. Okay, this is why we're ahead of the game, because the gods gave us all this knowledge. That's who the Apkallus were. Now, the Apkallus are the ones who are going to get demonized as the sons of God, and their sons, the Nephilim. And those figures in later Enochic literature appear as the Watchers and the Giants, illegitimate teachers of humankind. So Annus is saying this is the focus point, these Apkallu guys. Greenfield in DDD, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, if you're going to buy one reference book about this kind of stuff, this is the one, DDD.
DDD.
Says this, in Mesopotamian religion, the term Apkallu, Sumerian Abgal, is used for the legendary creatures endowed with extraordinary wisdom. 7 in number, they are the culture heroes from before the flood. Scholars of Mesopotamia, the scribes, Annus points out, the guys who were in charge of, the professors of their day, if you will, in Mesopotamia, they wanted to align themselves with the Apkallu, basically saying, well, we're so smart because we're in touch with the divine knowledge. We inherited it from them. And so they'd have an uppity student at some point in one of their classes say, well, how did you get that after the flood? Like, how do you? And so this is their version of how that knowledge was transmitted. Scholarly writings of the scribes in Mesopotamia are specifically linked to the Apkallu by a very deliberate tactic. The scribes would title their own works with names given to the Apkallu. This telegraphed the point that I'm your professor because I'm in touch with the gods. Okay, we inherited this information from them. So shut up and listen. Okay.
So what is going on? Are these all these things happening before the flood, is this something that we should all be worried about, or just to take to note? Because I always like to say, we do not fight against flesh and blood, but against the principalities that rule in the unseen realm. So many things that are going on that we don't know and understand. Who's to say that this can't be happening? I don't know. I know I'm not going to say that 100% for anything.
We know what we're talking about. Other Mesopotamian texts actually provide evidence for 4 post-flood Apkallu. These Apkallu are key players in understanding Genesis 6:1 through 4. So, to give you the story, the Apkallu are running around and they're the heroes because they're giving humans knowledge. They're wonderful. But some of the other gods don't really like humans. They're just, again, they're kind of icky. They make a lot of noise, so we got to get rid of them. You know, in some of the Mesopotamian stories, that's like, they're too noisy down there. Let's just kill them off. Yeah.
Wow.
So don't laugh. You probably thought that with your kids. You know, it's just, right?
That's terrible.
So they decide, okay, we're gonna send the flood. We're gonna put a stop to all this. You know, we're gonna punish them. And again, there are different versions for why the flood comes in Mesopotamia. But the Apkallu, again, there's this concern about, well, we've taught them all this stuff, and what's going to happen? How do we deal with this issue now? And so, what you have is the story of the flood, and then after the flood, you actually have texts that list out the Apkallu next to the king that they trained. Okay, and then you have the flood, and then after the flood, there's a text that has 4 post-flood Apkallu, and they are specifically described from that point on in a different way than they are pre-flood. Before the flood, they're classified in cuneiform as completely divine, but after the flood, they are said to be of human descent. Again, the only possible implication is that they had at least one human parent. And more than that, one of them is described as being only 2/3 Apkallu. So you have, again, this sort of hybridized kind of language used of the Apkallu after the flood. The 2/3 description becomes important because this is the same description as our Gilgamesh expert, Brian, can tell us. This is the description used of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is going to be linked to the Apkallu in some pretty specific ways. But presumably, this is Ann Kilmer now. She's another scholar who actually wrote before Honest. But this is about all she says in her article. She doesn't really run with it. She says, humans and Apkallu could presumably mate, since we have a description of the 4 post-flood Apkallu as of human descent, the 4th only 2/3, as opposed to pre-flood pure Apkallu, and subsequent human sages, the Umanu. So, you have this mixture, but then you get this hybridization thing going on.
This is also
now,
weird.
We're not told directly that Marduk is angry because of the cohabitation, but what we are told is that after the flood, they are of human descent, the Apkallu are, and Marduk is ticked. Marduk gets angry with the Apkallu and consigns them to the netherworld, never to return. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So we get that much in the Mesopotamian material. That they violate the divine order, again, the way Marduk wanted things to happen in the Babylonian version. Somehow, some sort of cohabitation is part of that. Before they were divine, then we've got a mixture after the flood. Marduk's mad, sends them to the underworld. And again, back to the 2/3 thing. Let's skip ahead here. The 2/3 thing used of Gilgamesh is important because Gilgamesh is not only called master of the Apkallu, but he's also described as a giant. Now, that's the real quick and dirty version of every point in Genesis 6:1 through 4 has a counterpoint in the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. That ought to suggest that, again, when the biblical writer writes Genesis 6:1 through 4, it's not a coincidence that what is written there matches up to this Mesopotamian story.
Interesting.
And not only that, but if we go back here, and we talk about where they're sent, the underworld, they're kept in a chasm, the Apsu, an abyss containing fiery pillars situated at the end of the great earth. Great earth is an unusual phrase. It's a name in the netherworld, for the netherworld in Mesopotamian texts. Kigal in Sumerian, the expression is found in the name of the Mesopotamian queen of the underworld, Eresh Kigal, the great earth, okay?
Wow. So could this all be resources for us to find out what was going on during Genesis 6? I don't know. Sometimes it seems like it's a lot to take things from other sources and be like, this is what the Bible is talking about. But then again, it was written around the same time, so maybe they did have some references. Maybe they did think about those things that were going on. I would love to know what you guys think about that for sure.
They wind up in, for lack of a better term, Mesopotamian hell. It's not hell like we think of in the New Testament, but it's the underworld. It's the realm of the dead. The Enochian material, the material written after the biblical stuff but before the New Testament, okay, intertestamental, Second Temple Jewish literature, for some reason, and there are academic explanations for this that make sense. But again, the quick version is, for some reason, whoever's writing the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and some of these other books, the Book of the Giants from Qumran, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever's writing this stuff knew the Apkallu story really well. And they write their version of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 with the Apkallu story in mind. So this is why Enoch has the offending watchers being sent to the realm of the dead and bound, because that's what happens to the Apkallu. We don't read that in Genesis 6. You only got 4 verses there. You get hints of it a little bit later with some of the Rephaim who live in the netherworld and passages like Ezekiel 32. You get little bits and pieces of it. But whoever's writing the Enochian stuff is really well aware of this. And they preserve the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. That's what they actually end up doing. We can know about it because we can go back today and read cuneiform stuff. That's what Honest did. That's what his whole article is about. Let's go back through, look at all the cuneiform stuff. Can we find, have an eye toward Genesis 6, 1 through 4? Can we find that stuff in the Mesopotamian flood stories? Let's take another look at it. And so he did in 2010, and the results are just awesome. I mean, he did a great job. So we can look at that and we can kind of know, what they're sort of fishing for, because if we know the Mesopotamian Apkallu story, we can read Genesis 6, 1 through 4 and say, okay, sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim, before and after the flood. Okay, we know what they're shooting at. But it's the Enoch stuff that adds their punishment. And that's the stuff that Peter and Jude pick up on.
Wow.
And winds up in Peter and Jude.
Yeah.
So you have a connection here. You've got Mesopotamian original context, you got Old Testament, you've got Second Temple period Judaism, and you got the New Testament. And there are threads that run through all 4 of them. It doesn't mean they're all canonical or inspired. Again, that doesn't mean that at all. But what it means is that if you go back to Genesis 6, 1 through 4 and say, I don't like this creepy supernatural stuff, I'm just going to take that out. You break the chain. You lose the original context. And you not only lose the original context, but you pit your interpretation of Genesis 6 against what Peter and Jude are doing. And what Peter and Jude are doing, they're doing specifically because they know all the other stopping points. You don't. They do.
So that's fascinating, guys. I would love to know what you think. Is this legitimate resources? Should we be taking stuff from this? I'm not saying it's anywhere close to being inspired word of God, but is the biblical text taking things, or were they taking things from the things that were going on during that time? I'd all love to know. Anyway, shout out to Dr. Michael Heiser for supporting and being a blessing through it all. Thank you so much for watching. I encourage you all to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. And click the link in the description to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. I encourage you to do that today, guys. Always remember, Jesus loves you.